Today I will bring you a very emotional story. Without further ado, let's start the story right now. The late September air in suburban Chicago carried a crispness that hinted at the coming fall, the kind of weather that made you want to curl up with a warm drink and someone you loved. At least that's what Sarah Harris told herself as she stood at the kitchen counter, staring out the window at the amber leaves drifting lazily to the ground. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. A silence that had become her constant companion over the past few months. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 6:45 p.m. Michael wouldn't be home for another hour if he came home at all. Lately, his construction projects had been keeping him late, or so he said. Sarah didn't know what to believe anymore. She turned back to the stove, stirring the pot of chili she'd been simmering for the past hour. It was Michael's favorite: ground beef, kidney beans, a touch of smoked paprika, just the way his mother used to make it. She'd spent the afternoon chopping onions and garlic, her hands still faintly smelling of the spices, hoping that the familiar scent would fill the house with something other than the emptiness that had settled between them. It was a small act of love, one of the few things she could still do to feel connected to him. But even as she stirred, she felt the hollowness in her chest grow. The chili wasn't going to fix what was broken. Nothing could. Sarah and Michael had been married for 10 years, a decade that had once felt like a triumph. They'd met in their mid-20s at a mutual friend's barbecue, where Michael had spilled a beer on her white sundress and spent the rest of the evening apologizing with that sheepish grin of his. She'd laughed it off, charmed by his awkward sincerity, and by the end of the night they were sitting on a picnic bench sharing a slice of watermelon and talking about their dreams. He wanted to build things, bridges, skyscrapers, homes, for families to grow in. She wanted a life full of love, a family of her own, and a partner who'd be there through it all. They'd fallen hard and fast, and within 2 years they were married in a small ceremony at a local park, surrounded by friends and family who couldn't stop gushing about how perfect they were together. And for a while they were. The early years were filled with late-night talks, spontaneous road trips, and the kind of laughter that made your stomach ache. They'd bought this house in the suburbs, a modest 2-story with a wraparound porch and a backyard big enough for the kids they'd planned to have. But the kids never came. After years of trying, countless doctor visits, and a miscarriage that had left Sarah hollowed out, they'd quietly let go of that dream. Michael had thrown himself into his work, climbing the ranks at his construction firm while Sarah had taken a job at a local bank, hoping the routine would fill the void. It hadn't. Now, at 35, Sarah felt like she was living in a house of cards, one wrong move away from collapse. She still loved Michael, God she did, but the warmth they'd once shared had been replaced by a quiet distance, a chasm that neither of them knew how to bridge. He was gone more often than not, leaving before dawn and coming home long after she'd gone to bed. When he was home, he was distracted, his mind still on blueprints and deadlines. Their conversations had become transactional. "Did you pay the electric bill? I'll be late again tomorrow. There are leftovers in the fridge." The man who used to leave her little notes on the bathroom mirror, silly things like, "You're my sunshine," or "Don't forget to smile today," hadn't written one in years. Sarah set the spoon down and wiped her hands on a dish towel, her movements mechanical. She caught her reflection in the glass door of the microwave, dark brown hair pulled into a messy bun, a few strands falling loose around her face, and her hazel eyes tired and shadowed. She looked older than she felt, or maybe she just felt older than she was. She didn't know anymore. All she knew was that she was lonely, achingly so, and the loneliness was starting to feel like a living thing, curling around her heart and squeezing tighter with every passing day. The front door creaked open and Sarah's heart lifted for a moment, a flicker of hope that maybe tonight would be different. "Michael?" she called, her voice softer than she'd intended. "Yeah, it's me," he replied, his tone flat, exhausted. She heard the thud of his work boots as he kicked them off in the entryway and the rustle of his jacket as he hung it on the rack. He appeared in the kitchen doorway a moment later, his broad shoulders filling the frame. Michael Harris was a big man, 6'2" with a build that spoke of years spent hauling lumber and climbing scaffolding. His dark hair was streaked with a few strands of gray now, and there were lines around his blue eyes that hadn't been there a few years ago. He looked tired, but then again, he always did these days. "Smells good," he said, nodding toward the stove. It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd gotten from him in weeks, and she clung to it like a lifeline. "Thanks," she said, forcing a smile. "It's your favorite. I thought maybe we could eat together tonight." Michael hesitated, and Sarah's stomach twisted. She knew that look, the one that meant he was about to disappoint her. "I'd love to, babe, but I've got to finish some paperwork for the site. We're behind schedule and the client's breathing down my neck. I'll eat later, okay?" Her smile faltered, but she nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Sure, I'll leave a bowl out for you." He crossed the kitchen in a few strides and pressed a quick kiss to her forehead, a gesture that felt more like habit than affection. "You're the best," he murmured, and then he was gone, disappearing, into his home office down the hall. The door clicked shut behind him, and Sarah was alone again. She turned back to the stove, her hands trembling as she ladled the chili into a bowl for herself. The warmth of the food did little to ease the coldness inside her. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd once spent hours playing cards and dreaming about their future, and ate in silence. Every bite tasted like ash, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing him. Not to another woman, but to the life they'd built together, the one that was supposed to be enough but somehow wasn't. On the outside, the Harrises were the picture of suburban bliss. Their neighbors, the Wilsons, often remarked on how lucky they were to have such a solid marriage. At the annual block party last month, Sarah had laughed and linked her arm through Michael's, playing the part of the happy wife while he grilled burgers and told stories about his latest project. Everyone had smiled and nodded, oblivious to the way Sarah's grip on his arm had tightened, as if she could hold on to him through sheer force of will. They didn't see the way Michael's eyes never quite met hers, or the way Sarah's laughter sounded just a little too bright, a little too forced. They didn't know that when they went back inside that night, Michael had fallen asleep on the couch with a beer in his hand, and Sarah had cried herself to sleep in their bed, the space between them growing wider with every passing day. The next morning, Sarah woke to an empty house. Michael had left a note on the counter, gone to the site. "Be back late. Love you." The words were written in his familiar scrawl, but they felt hollow, like a formality. She crumpled the note in her hand and tossed it into the trash, her chest tight with a mix of anger and despair. She didn't want his words on paper. She wanted him, his time, his attention, his presence. But he was slipping away, and she didn't know how to pull him back. At the bank, Sarah went through the motions, processing transactions and smiling at customers with a practiced ease that hid the storm inside her. She was good at her job, efficient, and friendly. The kind of employee who never let her personal life interfere with her work. But today her mind kept drifting, replaying the way Michael had looked at her last night, the way his kiss had felt more like a goodbye than a promise. "Hey Sarah, are you okay?" A voice broke through her thoughts, and she looked up to see James Carter standing at her desk. James was new at the bank, a senior loan officer who'd transferred from the downtown branch a few weeks ago. He was tall and lean, with sandy blonde hair and green eyes that seemed to see right through her. There was something about him, something confident, almost magnetic, that made her stomach flutter in a way she hadn't felt in years. "I'm fine," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired." "Are you sure?" James leaned against the edge of her desk, his voice low and warm. "You look like you could use a coffee. There's a new place down the street, my treat if you're up for it." Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding. She knew she should say no. She was married, and Michael was still the man she loved, even if things were falling apart. But the thought of sitting across from someone who actually wanted to talk to her, who looked at her like she was more than just a fixture in his life, was too tempting to resist. "Okay," she heard herself say, the words slipping out before she could stop. "To just a quick coffee?" James grinned, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt a spark of something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. But beneath that spark was a flicker of guilt, a quiet warning that she was stepping onto a path she might not be able to come back from. She ignored it, pushing the feeling down as she grabbed her purse and followed James out the door, the weight of her loneliness trailing behind her like a shadow. The coffee shop down the street from the bank was a cozy little place with exposed brick walls and the faint hum of indie music playing through the speakers. The air smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon, a comforting warmth that wrapped around Sarah Harris like a blanket as she stepped inside with James Carter. She hadn't been to a place like this in years, not since the early days with Michael, when they'd spend lazy Saturday mornings sipping lattes and sharing a croissant, their knees touching under the table as they laughed about nothing and everything. The memory stung, a sharp reminder of what she'd lost, but she pushed it down, focusing instead on the man walking beside her. James held the door open for her, his hand brushing lightly against her lower back as she passed. The touch was fleeting, innocent enough, but it sent a jolt through her, a spark that made her breath catch in her throat. She glanced at him and he smiled, a slow, easy smile that made his green eyes crinkle at the corners. He was handsome. There was no denying that. Tall and lean with a jawline that could cut glass and a confidence that seemed to radiate from him like heat. He was the kind of man who turned heads, the kind of man who knew it and didn't pretend otherwise. Sarah felt a flush creeping up her neck and she quickly looked away, pretending to study the chalkboard menu above the counter. "What's your poison?" James asked, his voice low and teasing, pulling her out of her thoughts. He was standing, close, too close maybe, and she could smell the faint scent of his cologne, something woodsy and warm that made her want to lean in and breathe deeper. Just a cappuccino," she said, her voice a little too high, a little too eager. She cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. "With an extra shot of espresso. I could use the boost." "Rough day?" he asked, his tone softening as he stepped up to the counter to order. He didn't wait for her answer, just added a black coffee for himself and handed over his card to the barista, a young woman with a nose ring who smiled at him a little too brightly. Sarah noticed, and a flicker of something, jealousy maybe, twisted in her gut. She shook her head, chastising herself. She had no right to feel possessive. She was married, for God's sake. Married to Michael, who was probably hunched over, blueprints right now, his brow furrowed in that way she used to find so endearing. The thought of him brought a pang of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by the way James turned back to her, his eyes locking onto hers like she was the only person in the room. They found a small table in the corner, tucked away from the bustle of the late morning crowd. Sarah sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her cappuccino, the warmth of the cup grounding her as she tried to ignore the way her pulse was racing. James leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually. Over the backrest, his posture relaxed but his gaze intense. He was watching her, really watching her in a way Michael hadn't in years. It made her feel seen, desired, and alive in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. "So," James said, taking a sip of his coffee, "you never answered my question. Rough day?" Sarah hesitated, her fingers tightening around her cup. She didn't want to talk about her day or her life, for that matter. She didn't want to admit that she'd woken up to an empty house again, that Michael's note had felt like a slap in the face, or that she was so lonely she could barely stand it. But James was looking at her with those eyes, and there was something about him, something warm and inviting, that made her want to spill everything. "It's been a rough few months, actually," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Work's fine, I guess. It's just everything else." James nodded, his expression softening. "I get that. Life can be a lot sometimes. Do you ever feel like you just need a break? A chance to, I don't know, let go for a little while?" His words hit her like a punch to the gut because that was exactly what she wanted, what she craved. A break from the monotony, from the silence, from the weight of a marriage that was slowly suffocating her. She wanted to feel something, anything, other than the emptiness that had taken root inside her And James, with his easy smile and his attentive gaze, was offering her a glimpse of that escape. "Yeah," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I do." He leaned forward then, his elbows resting on the table, closing the distance between them. "You deserve that, Sarah," he said, his voice low and earnest. "You deserve to feel good, to have some fun. You're too beautiful to be sitting here looking so sad." The compliment caught her off guard, and she felt her cheeks flush. Again. Beautiful. When was the last time Michael had called her that? She couldn't even remember. But here was James, saying it like it was the most obvious thing in the world, like he meant it with every fiber of his being. She looked down at her coffee, her heart pounding, a dangerous heat spreading through her chest. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let herself feel beautiful, desired, and wanted. She wanted to lean across the table and kiss him, to feel his lips on hers, to lose herself in the kind of reckless passion she hadn't felt in years. But she couldn't. She was married. She had a husband who loved her, even if he didn't show it the way he used to. She had a life, a home, and a promise she'd made 10 years ago to stand by Michael through better or worse. The ring on her finger felt heavy, a reminder of the vows she'd taken, the life she'd built. She thought of Michael's tired smile last night, the way he'd kissed her forehead before disappearing into his office. He was trying in his own way, wasn't he? "Sarah?" James's voice pulled her back to the present, and she realized she'd been staring at her coffee for too long. She looked up, and the concern in his eyes made her stomach flip. "You okay?" "Yeah," she lied, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. Just thinking." "About what?" he asked, his tone gentle but curious. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers as he adjusted the sugar packet she'd been fidgeting with. The touch was electric, sending a shiver up her spine, and she didn't pull away. She should have, but she didn't. "About a lot of things," she said, her voice barely audible. "Things I probably shouldn't be thinking about." James's lips curved into a knowing smile, and she felt a rush of heat at the way he was looking at her, like he could see right through her, like he knew exactly what she was thinking. "Sometimes the things we shouldn't think about are the ones we want the most," he said, his voice a low rumble that made her pulse race. "There's nothing wrong with wanting, Sarah. It's what makes us human." His words were like a match to kindling, igniting something inside her that she'd been trying to keep buried. Wanting. She wanted so much. Too much, maybe. She wanted to feel desired, to feel alive, to feel the kind of passion that made her heart race and her skin burn. She wanted to forget the loneliness, the silence, and the slow decay of her marriage. And James was sitting there, offering her all of that and more, with his easy charm and his dangerous smile. She pulled her hand back, her fingers trembling as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I should get back to work," she said, her voice shaky. "I've got a lot to do." James nodded, but the look in his eyes told her he wasn't buying her excuse. "Sure," he said, standing up and offering her his hand. "Let me walk." "You back?" She took his hand, her skin tingling where it touched his, and they left the coffee shop together, stepping back into the crisp September air. The walk back to the bank was short, but it felt like an eternity. Every step a battle between the part of her that wanted to run back to the safety of her desk and the part of her that wanted to turn to James and let him pull her into his arms. She could feel his presence beside her, the heat of him, the way he matched her stride like it was the most natural thing in the world. She stole a glance at him, taking in the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders and the way his hair caught the sunlight. And she felt a wave of desire so strong it made her dizzy. When they reached the bank, James held the door open for her again, his hand brushing against her arm as she passed. "Thanks for the coffee," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anytime," he replied, his smile soft but loaded with meaning. "I mean that, Sarah. Anytime you need a break or anything else. I'm here." She nodded, her throat tight, and hurried to her desk, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat down, her hands shaking as she tried to focus on the stack of paperwork in front of her, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the way James had looked at her, the way his touch had felt, and the way his words had made her feel wanted in a way she hadn't in years. She wanted him. God, she wanted him so badly it hurt. She wanted to feel his hands on her, his lips on hers, and his body pressed against hers in a way that would make her forget everything else. She wanted to lose herself in him, to let go of the guilt and the pain and the loneliness, if only for a little while. But the guilt was there, clawing at her, a constant reminder of the life she'd built with Michael. She thought of their wedding day, the way he'd looked at her as she walked down the aisle, his eyes shining with love and promise. She thought of the nights they'd spent tangled up in each other, whispering dreams into the darkness. She thought of the miscarriage, the way he'd held her as she cried, his own tears silent but steady against her shoulder. He'd been there, for her through the worst of it. He was still there, even if he was distant, even if he didn't see her the way he used to. She owed him more than this. She owed him her loyalty, her fidelity, and her love. But love felt so far away now, buried under layers of silence and resentment. And James was right here, offering her something she hadn't realized she needed so desperately until this moment. She closed her eyes, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming, relentless and intoxicating. She imagined what it would be like to kiss him, to feel his hands in her hair, and to hear him whisper her name in the dark. She imagined the thrill of it, the danger, the way it would make her feel alive again. The rest of the day passed in a blur, her mind a battlefield of desire and guilt. She went through the motions, smiling at customers and answering emails, but her thoughts were on James, on the way he'd looked at her and the way he'd made her feel. By the time she left the bank, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. She was halfway to her car when she heard his voice behind her. "Sarah, wait up." She turned, her heart leaping into her throat as James jogged. Toward her, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked effortlessly handsome, and the sight of him made her mouth go dry. "Hey," she said, her voice trembling. "What's up?" "I was thinking," he said, stopping a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. "There's this new Italian place downtown. I've been meaning to check it out. Want to grab dinner with me tonight? No pressure, just two friends, hanging out." The word friends felt like a lie, and they both knew it. There was nothing friendly about the way he was looking at her, nothing innocent about the way her body was responding to him. She should say no. She knew she should say no. But the thought of going home to an empty house, to another night of silence and loneliness, was more than she could bear. "Okay," she said, the word slipping out before she could stop it. "Dinner sounds nice." James's smile widened, and she felt a thrill of excitement mixed with a wave of guilt so strong it nearly knocked her over. She was crossing a line, one she might not be able to come back from. But as she followed him to his car, the heat of his presence beside her, she couldn't bring herself to care. Not tonight. Tonight, she wanted to feel something, anything, other than the emptiness that had become her life. Tonight she wanted to let herself want, to let herself be wanted, even if it meant betraying the man she'd promised to love forever. The Italian restaurant downtown was dimly lit, with flickering candles on every table and the soft hum of conversation filling the air. Sarah Harris sat across from James Carter, a glass of red wine in her hand, the ruby liquid catching the light as she swirled it absently. She hadn't meant for the night to go this far, hadn't meant to let herself get swept away. But here she was, her heart racing, her skin tingling with a kind of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. James was watching her, his green eyes dark with something that made her stomach flip, something hungry, something dangerous. She knew she should leave, should go home to Michael, but the thought of facing another night of silence, another night of pretending everything was fine, was more than she could bear. "You look beautiful tonight," James said, his voice low and rough, the kind of tone that sent a shiver down her spine. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers, and the contact was like a spark, igniting a fire that had been smoldering inside her all day. That dress, it's been driving me crazy since you walked in. Sarah felt her, cheeks flush, a mix of embarrassment and desire. She'd chosen the dress carefully, a deep blue wrap dress that hugged her curves, the neckline just low enough to hint at what lay beneath. She hadn't worn it in years, not since a date night with Michael that felt like a lifetime ago. But tonight, she'd wanted to feel beautiful, wanted to see that look in James's eyes. And there it was, raw and unfiltered, making her feel like a woman again, not just a wife, not just a shadow in her own home. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the clink of glasses and the murmur of other diners. She took a sip of her wine, the warmth of it spreading through her chest, loosening the knot of guilt that had been tightening there all evening. She shouldn't be here. She knew that. But the way James was looking at her, the way his thumb was tracing slow circles on the back of her hand, made it impossible to care. Dinner passed in a blur of stolen glances and lingering touches, each one more charged than the last. By the time they finished their meal, Sarah was dizzy with want, her body humming with a need she couldn't ignore. James paid the bill, his hand finding hers as they left the restaurant, his grip firm and possessive in a way that made her knees weak. They stepped into the cool night air, the city lights casting a soft glow around them, and Sarah felt a thrill of recklessness, a desire to let go of everything holding her back. "My place isn't far," James said, his voice a low growl as he pulled her closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Come with me, Sarah. Just for a little while." She knew what he was asking, and knew what it would mean if she said yes. But the heat of his body against hers, the way his hand slid down, to the small of her back pressing her against him, made it impossible to say no. She wanted him so badly it hurt, a deep, aching need. As he smiled, a predatory edge to it that made her pulse race. The drive to his apartment was a haze of tension, the air between them thick with unspoken promises. When they finally stumbled through his door, James didn't waste a moment, his hands on her before the lock even clicked shut. He pushed her against the wall, his lips crashing into hers with a hunger that stole her breath, and Sarah melted into him, her fingers tangling in his hair as she kissed him back with equal fervor. His mouth was hot and demanding, tasting of wine and desire, and she moaned softly as his hands roamed her body, slipping under the hem of her dress to grip her thighs. "God, Sarah," he groaned against her lips, his voice rough with need. "I've wanted this since the moment I saw you. You have no idea how much you've been driving me insane." His words sent a jolt of heat through her, and she arched into him, her body responding to his touch like it had been starved for it. She felt alive, electric, every nerve ending on fire as he kissed his way down her neck, his teeth grazing her skin in a way that made her gasp. She wanted more of his hands, more of his mouth, more of the way he made her feel like she was the only thing that mattered. She tugged at his shirt, her fingers fumbling with the buttons, desperate to feel his skin against hers, and he chuckled softly, the sound low and wicked as he helped her, shrugging the fabric off to reveal the lean, muscled planes of his chest. They stumbled to his bedroom, a tangle of limbs and whispered promises, and when he finally pressed her down, onto the bed, his body covering hers, Sarah felt a rush of pleasure so intense it bordered on pain. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word was a drug, and she was addicted, lost in the heat of him. The way he moved against her, the way he made her feel wanted in a way she hadn't in years. When it was over, she lay in his arms, her body still trembling with the aftershocks, a lazy smile on her lips as she traced the lines of his chest with her fingertips. She felt sated, fulfilled, the kind of satisfaction that came from giving in to something she'd craved for so long. That was... James trailed off, his voice hoarse as he pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You're incredible, Sarah." She smiled, a flush of pride mixing with the lingering guilt that had started to creep back in. "So are you," she whispered, her voice soft but heavy with the weight of what they'd done. She knew she should feel worse. should be drowning in shame for betraying Michael. But in that moment, wrapped in James's arms, all she could feel was the glow of satisfaction, the thrill of being desired. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and secret rendezvous. Sarah and James found excuses to be together whenever they could, lunch breaks that stretched too long, late nights at the bank under the guise of catching up on paperwork, even a weekend trip to Yare, a nearby town, where they checked into a quaint bed and breakfast under false names, giggling like teenagers as they slipped into their room. Each encounter was more intoxicating than the last, their desire for each other a fire that refused to be quenched. In a dimly lit motel room, James would pull her close, his hands rough and urgent, as he whispered how much he needed her, how she drove him wild with every look, every touch. Sarah would lose herself in the heat of his kisses, the way his fingers dug into her hips and the way he groaned her name like a prayer as they moved together, their bodies slick with sweat and desperation. Afterward, she'd lie beside him, her skin still tingling, her heart racing with a mix of exhilaration and guilt. The pleasure was undeniable, a high she couldn't get enough of, but it came with a price. Every time she left James's arms, the weight of her betrayal settled, heavier on her shoulders, a shadow that followed her home. She'd slip back into her life with Michael, playing the part of the dutiful wife, but the cracks were starting to show. Sarah was different now, and she knew it. She was more distracted, her mind often drifting to James even when she was with Michael. She'd catch herself smiling at nothing, her thoughts replaying the way James had looked at her the last time they were together, the way his hands had felt on her skin. She started paying more attention to her appearance, wearing makeup more often and choosing outfits that made her feel sexy and desirable. She told herself it was for her, that she was just reclaiming her confidence, but deep down she knew it was for James, for the way his eyes lit up when he saw her. Michael noticed the changes, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what was different. Sarah was brighter somehow, but also more distant. She'd always been beautiful, but lately, there was a glow about her, a spark he hadn't seen in years. At first, he thought it was a good thing. Maybe she was finally coming out of the fog that had settled over their marriage. But there were other things too, things that made his stomach twist with unease. She was on her phone more often, her fingers flying across the screen as she texted someone, her lips curving into a secret smile that made his chest ache. She'd started staying late at the bank, her excuses vague and unconvincing. "We're swamped with paperwork," or "I'm helping a new colleague get settled." She'd come home smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't his, a scent that lingered on her clothes and made his heart sink. One night, as they sat at the kitchen table, Michael watched her over the rim of his coffee mug, his brow furrowed with a suspicion he didn't want to name. Sarah was scrolling through her phone, her expression soft, almost dreamy, and he felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years. Jealousy. "Who are you texting?" he asked, his voice casual but laced with an edge he couldn't hide. Sarah looked up, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second before she smiled, the expression a little too bright, a little too forced. "Just a friend from work," she said, setting her phone face down on the table. "We're planning a team lunch tomorrow." Michael nodded, but the knot in his stomach tightened. He wanted to believe her. God, he did. But there was something in her voice, something in the way she wouldn't meet his eyes that made him doubt. He thought of the way she'd been lately, the way she seemed to be pulling away from him even more than before, and he felt a cold dread settle in his chest. He didn't want to think it, didn't want to let the idea take root, but the question was there, whispering in the back of his mind. Was she seeing someone else? Sarah saw the look on his face, the way his jaw tightened, and her heart stuttered with guilt. She reached across the table, her hand covering his, her touch warm but trembling. "I love you, Michael," she said, her voice soft but earnest, as if she could erase her betrayal with those 3 words. And she did love him. She did. But it wasn't enough to stop her from wanting James, from craving the way he made her feel. Michael squeezed her hand, his smile tight but genuine. "I love you too," he said. And for a moment Sarah let herself believe that everything would be okay, that she could have both, the safety of her marriage and the thrill of her affair. But deep down she knew it was a lie, a fragile illusion that was bound to shatter. And as she sat there, her hand in Michael's, her mind drifted to James, to the next time she'd see him, to the next time she'd lose herself in the heat of the forbidden, and she felt a rush of anticipation that drowned out the guilt, if only for a little while. The October air in suburban Chicago had turned colder, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and made you crave the warmth of home. But for Sarah Harris, home had become a battlefield, a place where every glance, every word carried the weight of her secrets. She'd been careful, more careful than she ever thought she'd need to be. But the guilt was eating at her, a constant gnawing in her chest that she couldn't escape. She'd tried to pull back from James, to put some distance between them, but the pull of him was too strong. The memory of his touch too intoxicating. Every time she told herself it was the last time, she found herself back in his arms, her body betraying her better judgment, her heart torn between the man she loved and the man she craved. Michael Harris, meanwhile, had been wrestling with his own demons. The suspicion that had taken root in his mind over the past few weeks had grown into a full-blown obsession, a dark cloud that followed him everywhere. He'd tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that Sarah was just stressed, that her late nights and secretive smiles were nothing to worry about, but the signs were there, piling up like bricks in a wall he couldn't tear down. The cologne on her clothes, the way she'd started locking her phone, the way she seemed to be living in a world he couldn't reach. He didn't want to believe. She was cheating, he couldn't bear the thought of it, but the doubt was a splinter in his mind, sharp and unrelenting. It was a Thursday evening when the truth came crashing down, and it happened in the most unexpected way. Michael had come home early for once, a rare break in his grueling schedule at the construction site. He'd been hoping to surprise Sarah, to maybe rekindle some of the warmth they'd lost. He'd even stopped by the grocery store on his way home, picking up a bottle of her favorite wine and a bouquet of daisies. Her favorite flower, the ones she'd carried in her bouquet on their wedding day. He'd walked into the house with a flicker of hope in his chest, calling out her name as he kicked off his boots in the entryway. "Sarah? You home, babe?" His voice echoed through the quiet house, but there was no answer. He frowned, setting the wine and flowers on the kitchen counter as he glanced around. Her car was in the driveway, so she had to be here somewhere. Maybe she was in the shower or taking a nap. He headed upstairs, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood, his mind already picturing the way her face might light up when she saw the flowers. But as he reached the top of the stairs, he heard it, a faint buzz coming from the bedroom. He paused, his brow furrowing as he followed the sound. It was coming from Sarah's nightstand where her phone sat, the screen lit up with an incoming message. Michael hesitated, his hand hovering over the phone. He'd never been the type to snoop. Trust had always been the foundation of their marriage, but the suspicion that had been gnawing at him for weeks was too loud to ignore. He picked up the phone, his heart pounding as he saw the name on the screen, James. The message preview was enough to make his blood run cold. "Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about you. When can I see you again?" Michael's hand tightened around the phone, his vision blurring as the words seared into his mind. Last night when Sarah had told him she was working late at the bank, she'd come home after midnight with that faint smile on her lips, the one he'd thought was exhaustion, but now realized was something else entirely. His chest constricted, a wave of nausea rolling through him as the pieces fell into place. The late nights, the cologne, the way she'd been pulling away from him. It was true. It was all true. She was cheating on him. He didn't know how long he stood there staring at the phone, his mind a chaotic storm of disbelief and rage. But then he heard the front door open downstairs, Sarah's voice calling out as she stepped inside. "Michael, are you home?" Her voice snapped him out of his daze, and the anger that had been simmering inside him erupted, a white-hot fury that burned through every ounce of restraint he had left. He stormed down the stairs, the phone still clutched in his hand, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Sarah was in the kitchen setting her purse on the counter, and she froze when she saw him, her eyes widening at the look on his face. "Michael, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling as she took a step back. She'd never seen him like this, his face pale, his eyes blazing with a rage that made her stomach drop. What's wrong? He repeated, his voice low and dangerous, each word dripping with venom. He held up her phone, the screen still glowing with James's message, and Sarah's heart stopped. Sarah, this is what's fucking wrong." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her mind was racing, panic clawing at her as she realized what he'd seen, what he knew. "Michael, I can explain," she stammered, her voice breaking as she reached for him, but he jerked away, his expression a mix of disgust and betrayal. "Explain?" he roared, his voice echoing through the house, making her flinch. "Explain what, Sarah? That you've been fucking some guy behind my back? That you've been lying to me for God knows how long? That you've been making a fool out of me while I've been working my ass off to keep this family together?" Tears welled in her eyes, her hands shaking as she tried to find the words to defend herself, but there was nothing she could say that would make this right. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry, Michael, I didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean for it to happen?" He spat, his voice rising with every word. "You didn't mean to spread your legs for some asshole at work? You didn't mean to throw away 10 years of marriage for a cheap thrill? What the hell is wrong with you, Sarah? What did I do to deserve this?" His words hit her like a slap, each one cutting deeper than the last. She wanted to tell him it wasn't about him, that it was about her loneliness, her need to feel something, anything, but she knew he wouldn't understand. How could he, when she barely understood it herself? "I was lonely," she said, her voice cracking as the tears spilled down her cheeks. "You were never here, Michael. You were always working, always gone, and I felt like I was disappearing. I needed someone to see me." Michael's face twisted with rage, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "So this is my fault?" he shouted, his voice raw with pain. "You're blaming me for your betrayal? I was working for us, Sarah, for our future, for the life we said we wanted. And you couldn't even wait for me to come home? You couldn't even talk to me about how you were feeling? Instead, you go and fuck some guy who probably doesn't give a damn about you?" "He does care about me," she shot back, her voice rising in desperation, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "He sees me, Michael. He makes me feel wanted, like I'm more than just a piece of furniture in your life. You haven't looked at me like that in years." The silence that followed was deafening, the air between them crackling with tension. Michael's face went slack, the anger giving way to a kind of devastation that broke Sarah's heart all over. "Again, you think I don't see you?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper, each word laced with a pain so raw it made her chest ache. "I see you every damn day, Sarah. I see the woman I fell in love with, the woman I promised to spend my life with. But I guess that doesn't mean anything to you anymore, does it?" "Michael, that's not true," she said, her voice trembling as she took a step toward him, her hands reaching out in a desperate plea. "I still love you. I do. I made a mistake. A horrible, stupid mistake. But we can fix this." "We can fix this?" He cut her off, his voice rising again, the anger surging back to the surface. "How the hell are we supposed to fix this, Sarah? You've been lying to my face, sneaking around with some guy, letting him touch you, kiss you, do God knows what else while I've been here trying to be a good husband. You think I can just forget that? You think I can just pretend it didn't happen?" "I'll end it," she said quickly, her voice frantic as she tried to salvage what was left of their marriage. "I'll stop seeing him, I swear. I'll do whatever it takes, Michael. Please, just give me a chance to make this right." But Michael was already shaking his head, his eyes hard and cold in a way she'd never seen before. "It's too late for that," he said, his voice flat, final. "You made your choice, Sarah. You chose him over me, over us. And I can't live with that. I can't look at you without seeing him, without wondering what you did, what you said, and how many times you lied to me. I can't do this anymore. Michael, please," she begged, her voice breaking as she grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Don't do this. Don't throw away everything we have. We can get through this. I know we can. I love you." He yanked his arm free, his expression a mix of anger and heartbreak that made her stomach twist. "You don't get to say that," he said, his voice low and venomous. You don't get to talk about love after what you've done. You've destroyed us, Sarah. You've destroyed everything." He turned away from her then, storming toward the front door, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, like he couldn't get away from her fast enough. Sarah followed him, her sobs echoing through the house as she pleaded with him to stay, to talk, to give her a chance to explain. But he didn't stop, didn't even look back as he grabbed his jacket and keys, the door slamming behind him with a finality that made her knees buckle. She sank to the floor, her body shaking with the force of her cries, the reality of what she'd done crashing over her like a tidal wave. She'd lost him. She'd lost Michael, the man who'd loved her through every storm, the man who'd held her when she'd fallen apart, the man she'd promised to love forever. And for what? A few stolen moments with James, a fleeting thrill that had already started to fade in the face of what she'd just destroyed? She didn't know how long she sat there, the house silent around her, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on her like a physical thing. But as the minutes stretched into hours, one thought kept circling in her mind, a bitter truth she couldn't escape. She'd made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. Her marriage was over, shattered by her own hands, and there was no going back. The neon sign of the motel flickered in the darkness, casting a sickly yellow glow across the cracked pavement of the parking lot. Michael Harris sat in his truck, the engine long since turned off, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He didn't know how long he'd been there, hours maybe, since he'd stormed out of the house, leaving Sarah's sobs echoing behind him. The night was cold, the kind of chill that seeped through the windows and settled into his bones, but he barely felt it. All he could feel was the ache in his chest, a hollow, gaping wound where his heart used to be. He'd driven aimlessly at first the city lights blurring past him as he tried to outrun the images in his mind. Sarah with another man, her lips on someone else's, her body tangled in sheets that weren't his. The message on her phone played on a loop in his head. "Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about you." Each word was a knife, slicing deeper into the trust he'd once held so dear, the trust he'd thought was unbreakable. He'd loved her with everything he had built his life around her, and she'd thrown it all away for a cheap affair, for a man who probably didn't even know the first thing about her, the real her, the woman Michael had spent a decade learning to love. The pain was suffocating, a physical weight that pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. He'd always thought heartbreak was just a figure of speech, something people said to sound dramatic, but now he understood. It was real, raw, a tearing apart of everything he'd believed in. He'd lost her, not just to another man, but to the lies, the betrayal, and the slow erosion of the life they'd built together. He'd lost the woman he'd married, the one who'd laughed with him on their first date, who'd cried in his arms after their miscarriage, who'd promised to love him forever. That woman was gone, replaced by a stranger who'd looked him in the eye and lied, who'd let another man touch her while Michael was working late, trying to provide for their future. He leaned his head back against the seat, his eyes burning, with unshed tears. He didn't want to cry, not here, not now, but the grief was too much, a tidal wave he couldn't hold back. A sob broke free, rough and jagged, and then another, until he was crying in a way he hadn't since he was a kid, his shoulders shaking with the force of it. He cried for the life he'd lost, for the dreams they'd shared, and for the family they'd never had. He cried for the man he'd been before tonight, the one who'd believed in love, in loyalty, in the vows they'd taken. That man was gone now, shattered by the woman he'd trusted most in the world. Trust. The word felt like a cruel joke now. Michael had always prided himself on being a good husband, a good man. He'd worked hard, long hours at the construction site, his body aching from the labor, all so he could give Sarah the life she deserved. He'd thought he was doing the right thing, thought his sacrifices were a testament to his love. But now, he saw them for what they were, a blind spot, a failure to see how far apart they'd drifted. She'd been lonely, she'd said. She'd needed someone to see her. The words echoed in his mind, each one a fresh wound. He'd failed her in a way, but did that justify what she'd done? Did that make it okay for her to betray him, to break their vows, to let another man into the space that was supposed to be sacred? He didn't think he'd ever trust again. Not Sarah, not anyone. The betrayal had carved a hole in him, a void that would never fully heal. He'd always been the steady one, the rock, the man who believed in second chances. But this was different. This wasn't a mistake he could forgive, a wound he could bandage. This was a betrayal so deep it had shattered the foundation of everything he'd held dear. He couldn't look at her without seeing James, without imagining what they'd done, what she'd let him do. The thought made his stomach churn, a mix of disgust and despair that left him feeling hollow. Michael wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tried to pull himself together. He couldn't go back home. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. The house they'd shared, the one they'd filled with dreams and memories, felt tainted now, a place where every corner would remind him of her betrayal. He'd checked into the motel on instinct, needing a place to escape. But even here, in the sterile anonymity of a cheap room, he couldn't outrun the pain. It followed him, a shadow he couldn't shake, a reminder of everything he'd lost. The decision came to him slowly, a quiet certainty that settled over him like a fog. He couldn't stay with her. He couldn't live with the constant doubt, the questions that would haunt him every time she left the house, every time she smiled at her phone. He couldn't be the man who looked the other way, who pretended everything was fine when it wasn't. He deserved better than that, even if he didn't feel like he deserved anything right now. He deserved a life where he wasn't second-guessing every word, every touch, every glance. And Sarah, she'd made her choice. She'd chosen James, chosen the thrill of the affair over the life they'd built together. There was no coming back from that. He pulled out his phone, his hands trembling as he typed out a message to Sarah. "I'm done, I can't do this anymore. I'll come by tomorrow to get my things." He hit send before he could second-guess himself, the finality of the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. It was over. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of love and laughter and shared dreams gone in an instant, reduced to a single text message sent from a motel parking lot in the middle of the night. Michael leaned his head against the steering wheel, his eyes closing as the weight of his decision settled over him. He was alone now, truly alone, in a way he'd never been before. The road ahead was uncertain, a dark expanse of grief and healing he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't go back. The life he'd known was gone, shattered by Sarah's betrayal, and all he could do now was pick up the pieces and try to find a way forward, one broken step at a time. Months had passed since the night Michael walked out, but for Sarah Harris, the weight of her betrayal still clung to her like a second skin. She'd lost everything: her marriage, her sense of self, and the life she'd taken for granted. The emptiness was unbearable, a void she couldn't fill no matter how hard she tried. She'd cut James out of her life the day after Michael left, the thrill of their affair replaced by a bitter shame that made her sick to her stomach. She'd been a fool, chasing a fleeting high at the cost of the man who'd loved her most. Now she was alone, grappling with the wreckage she'd created. Therapy had become her lifeline, a weekly ritual where she poured out her guilt to a kind-eyed woman named Dr. Ellis. Through tear-streaked sessions, Sarah unraveled the layers of her loneliness, her need for validation, and the choices that had led her to James. She learned to face the truth. She'd betrayed Michael not because he'd failed her, but because she'd failed herself. The realization was a bitter pill, but it was also a step toward healing. Dr. Ellis had suggested writing a letter to Michael, not to send, but to process her feelings. So Sarah wrote, her words raw and unfiltered, an apology that poured from her heart. "I'm sorry for the pain I caused you, for breaking the trust we built, and for letting my weakness destroy us. I'll never forgive myself. But I hope you can find peace." She folded the letter, her hands trembling, but she couldn't bring herself to send it. What right did she have to ask for his forgiveness? Michael, meanwhile, had moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city, a stark contrast to the home he'd shared with Sarah. He'd thrown himself into work, the long hours a distraction from the ache that still lingered in his chest. But on quiet nights when the world was still, he'd find himself thinking about her, about the way she'd laughed at his terrible jokes, the way she'd looked on their wedding day, her eyes shining with love. He missed her, despite everything. And that was the hardest part. He didn't know if he could ever forgive her, but he couldn't erase the love they'd shared, the history that had shaped him. On a chilly December evening, Sarah stood outside Michael's apartment, the letter clutched in her gloved hand. Her heart pounded as she stared at the door, the weight of her past pressing down on her. She wanted to knock, to beg for a chance to make things right, but fear held her back. What if he hated her? What if he'd moved on? She didn't know if he'd ever opened the door, or his heart, to her again. The choice was hers, but the outcome was uncertain, a fragile thread of hope hanging in the balance. What do you think about the above story? Please leave a comment to let us know. Thank you for listening to the whole story. Goodbye, send the thrill of the affair over the life they'd built together. There was no coming back from that.